Welcome to this week's edition of Under the Radar for Saturday, March 11th. And let's dive straight into this week's topic, which is all about moral outrage. Now, you may have noticed that moral outrage is fashionable these days, so it was timely that a study came out last week shedding light on the reasons for moral outrage, which I only found out about because it was talked about on an Australian political show called The Outsiders last Sunday. Here's Ross Cameron.
Well, look, I want to draw the viewers' attention, to the latest edition of Motivation and Emotion, which is an eminent scholarly journal of the psychology profession, usually strongly left in its orientation. But just this week, we have a new piece of research published by the Bowdoin psychology professor Zachary Rothschild and University of Southern Mississippi psychology professor Lucas Kiefer. And it looks at the dynamics of outrage, of this outrage industry. And it studied 5 different focus groups. And what it really found was that moral outrage is being used by the progressive mind as a way to kind of whitewash its own sense of guilt and complicity as members of this big white shame group.
And by the way, The Outsiders on Sky News at 10 in the morning on Sunday is probably the best political show on Australian TV. And no, I wasn't paid to say that, but I would be very happy to shill for them. So through some very helpful contacts, I was able to get my hands on a copy of this study titled A Cleansing Fire: Moral Outrage Alleviates Guilt and Buffers Threats to One's Moral Identity. Social psychologists use the term moral outrage to describe these feelings of anger, which are directed at a third party for violating some moral standard of justice or fairness, because this outrage is often expressed on behalf of the victim of that moral violation. Moral outrage has been described as a pro-social emotion reflecting a desire to restore justice by fighting on behalf of the victimised. Lauded as a force for promoting positive social outcomes, moral outrage is associated with numerous behaviours including support for political action, protest participation and a desire to punish moral transgressors on behalf of innocent victims. However, this altruistic portrayal of outrage has been called into question by research showing that people express greater moral outrage following threats to their in-group's moral status. These findings suggest that moral outrage is sometimes defensively grounded in a threat to one's own moral standing, rather than a desire for justice per se. Now, I'm willing to bet that a lot of you out there listening to this aren't surprised by that finding at all. How could you be, given the prevalence of white guilt? Feelings of guilt are a direct threat to one's sense that they are a moral person, and accordingly, research on guilt finds that this emotion elicits strategies aimed at alleviating guilt that do not always involve undoing one's actions. Furthermore, research shows that individuals respond to reminders of their group's moral culpability with feelings of outrage at third-party harm-doing. These findings suggest that feelings of moral outrage, long thought to be grounded solely in concerns with maintaining justice, may sometimes reflect efforts to maintain a moral identity. In other words, while outrage often aims to correct an injustice in the world, in some situations, expressions of defensive outrage may be driven by a need to restore a moral identity. So they conducted 5 studies, and I'm just going to briefly go over one of them. In the first study, participants read a newspaper article about the exploitation of workers in a third world sweatshop with awful working conditions. Participants then rated the extent to which they believed workers suffered. Then they indicated the extent they engage in behaviours that indirectly or directly contribute to the perpetuation of sweatshops. For example, when given a statement like, "I buy products without knowing where they're made," and participants indicated the extent to which that statement was true for them. Then the participants' level of guilt was measured, then their moral outrage directed at international corporations was measured, and then participants' support for retributive punishment was measured. So the results of Study 1 showed that guilt predicted increased punitiveness toward a third-party harm doer due to increased moral outrage at the target. These results provide initial support for the proposed guilt-driven account of moral outrage. Specifically, they support the view that guilt, a marker of perceived moral identity threat, is associated with greater outrage and punishment of third-party harm-doing despite the common belief that these emotional and behavioural responses are independent of egoistic concerns. The fact that these effects emerge despite controlling for general negative affect suggests that the relationship between guilt and outrage is unlikely to be the result of non-moral negative affect. Rather, outrage and a desire for punishment appear to be motivated by guilt specifically. Now, the authors say at the end that moral outrage isn't necessarily a bad thing if it leads to pro-social or even self-sacrificial actions. And fair enough, but I think we see more examples of moral outrage today that don't result in pro-social behaviour. In fact, the exact opposite. Which leads me to the next story. College protesters send professor to the ER. On Thursday, hundreds of students at Middlebury College shouted down political scientist Charles Murray, forcing him to deliver his remarks in a private room via a live web stream.
Charles Murray, go away! Racist, sexist, anti-gay! 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 We cannot tolerate it! Your message is hatred!
How unoriginal are these dickheads? Do they have anything other than bigotry bingo chants? While he delivered his remarks, student troublemakers pulled the building's fire alarm multiple times. Shouting could be heard in the background throughout the live stream lecture and subsequent conversation with political science professor Alison Stanger. When Stanger and Murray left the building, things turned violent, the Addison County Independent reports. As Stanger, Murray and a college administrator left McCulloch Student Centre last evening following the event, they were physically and violently confronted by a group of protesters, according to Bill Berger, the college's Vice President for Communications and Marketing. Berger said college public safety officers managed to get Stanger and Murray into the administrator's car. The protesters then violently set upon the car, rocking it, pounding on it, jumping on and tried to prevent it from leaving campus, he said. At one point, a large traffic sign was thrown in front of the car. Public safety officers were able, finally, to clear the way to allow the vehicle to leave campus. During this confrontation outside McCulloch, one of the demonstrators pulled Professor Stanger's hair and twisted her neck, Berger continued. She was attended to at Porter Hospital later and is wearing a neck brace. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in the column of non-pro-social behaviour. Now, Charles Murray, for those of you that don't know, co-authored The Bell Curve back in 1994 and was considered then and now controversial because it tackled issues of IQ, race and gender. So, of course, those that haven't read it and or think their emotional reactions take priority over factual analysis basically think that Murray was promoting a form of eugenics, which makes him literally Hitler. Now, I read the book almost 20 years ago, but I got to be honest, I don't really remember it that well. But here's what Murray had to say in defence of the bell curve. I should begin by pointing out that the topic of the bell curve was not race, but as the book's subtitle says, intelligence and class structure in American life. Our thesis was that over the last half of the 20th century, American society has become cognitively stratified. At the beginning of the penultimate chapter, Herrnstein and I summarised our message. Predicting the course of society is chancy, but certain tendencies seem strong enough to worry about. An increasingly isolated cognitive elite, a merging of the cognitive elite with the affluent, a deteriorating quality of life for people at the bottom end of the cognitive distribution. Unchecked, these trends will lead the US towards something resembling a case society with the underclass mired ever more firmly at the bottom and the cognitive elite ever more firmly anchored at the top, restructuring the rules of society so that it becomes harder and harder for them to lose. It is obvious that these conclusions have not been discredited in the 22 years since they were written. They may be more accurately described as prescient. Now, as I said, I've read the book, but I can't remember thinking it was racist, but it was a long time ago, so I'll leave that for others to decide. But even if it was, in the interest of free speech, I'd still prefer to hear what he has to say, which probably means I wouldn't fit in at university these days. But Murray wasn't even at Middlebury to talk about that book. He was there to talk about his new book, Coming Apart, which focuses on what he sees as the decline in morality and values of white Americans, which kind of undermines the white supremacist angle, doesn't it? Now listen to the fragile snowflake's objections to Murray. Before Murray's lecture, over 500 alumni signed a letter which claimed that Murray's visit sends a message to every woman, every person of colour, every first-generation student, every poor and working-class person, every disabled person, and every queer person that not only their acceptance to and presence at Middlebury, but also their safety, their agency, their humanity, and even their very right to exist are all up for debate. The letter closes by asserting that Murray's presence on campus directly endangers members of the community.
Oh, Jesus!
It's so predictable. You don't even have to read it. Conflating someone speaking with a threat to their safety and humanity and their existence. Pathetic, hysterical children. Just take one of those claims that is threatening the humanity of queer people. The idea that Murray is anti-queer is especially odd. Murray was publicly pushing Republicans to support marriage equality before Hillary Clinton had flip-flopped on the issue. Yeah, he's a real threat to gay people. But again, this highlights the intellectual laziness of the left social justice crowd. They'd rather play bigotry bingo than debate and argue. And let's finish off with a story about virtue signalling that may have backfired. You may remember back in January when Starbucks announced they would hire up to 10,000 refugees in the wake of President Trump's executive order on immigration to virtue signal their moral superiority. Well, it appears that hasn't paid off as well as they might have hoped. Starbucks brand perception has plummeted since it announced plans to hire refugees. Starbucks brand has taken a beating since the company announced plans to hire 10,000 refugees worldwide in the next 5 years in response to Donald Trump's executive order intended to prevent refugees entering the US. The coffee giant's consumer perception levels have fallen by 2/3 since late January, according to YouGov Brand Index. The perception tracker measures if respondents have heard anything about the brand in the last 2 weeks through advertising, news, or word of mouth. Was it positive or negative? In Starbucks' case, perception is still overall positive, but significantly lower than it was prior to CEO Howard Schultz published a public letter outlining the company's plans to give refugees jobs. And here is the offending chart with the red arrow showing the point in time the announcement made by Starbucks. YouGov says there's reason to believe backlash will impact the chain's bottom line. 2 days before Starbucks' announcement, 30% of consumers said they'd consider buying from Starbucks the next time they were craving coffee, the highest proportion in nearly a year. Now the percentage is down to 24% according to YouGov. So it remains to be seen if Starbucks will actually pay a price for their virtue signalling. Maybe it'll all blow over, but private companies are always a good barometer for measuring the sincerity of their commitment to social justice causes. Because if it affects the bottom line enough, you can bet they'll abandon it quick smart. So that's all the moral outrage I have for this week's Under the Radar. Don't forget, if you enjoyed this video, to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, or consider supporting the channel via Patreon. See you next time.